Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Reardon, and I am Vice President of Client Services at Stateside Associates. I'd first like to welcome or thank NLC for partnering with us on this webinar addressing local issues in an era of preemption. Thank you for joining the webinar, and we're going to get started. But first, some logistics. Everyone's line will be muted during the call, so if you have any questions, please submit them using the chat function, and we will do our best to answer all of them at the end of the presentation or follow up with you afterwards with an answer. So with that, let me hand it over to Brooks Rainwater, who's the Senior Executive and Director of the Center for City Solutions here at NLC.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to talk about city rights in an era of preemption, which is part of a city-state research initiative that NLC is pleased to conduct with the state municipal leagues. The urgency for this research comes at an important time for our country, one characterized by transition and an evolving relationship between city leaders and their counterparts at the state and federal level. Local leaders must be empowered to adapt policies to meet the needs of their community members, ensuring cities have the tools to build stronger economies, promote innovation, and move the country forward. State preemption efforts can lead to a loss of control for cities and ultimately their citizens. If you haven't yet seen the report, you can find it at nlc.org/preemption. I will now hand it over to NLC Director of Research, Christy McFarland, to provide an overview of our findings. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Brooks, and thank you, Tim. Before we dig into the report findings, I want to point out an important distinction that is often overlooked in discussions of preemption. There's a great deal of diversity in state and local relations between as well as within states. Generally speaking, states provide either narrow governing authority, known as Dillon's Rule, or broad authority to cities, known as Home Rule. This is defined in state constitutions or by statutes enacted by the state legislature. Cities in Dillon's Rule states are broadly preempted in many of the areas discussed in our report. However, there are many instances of larger cities in Dillon's Rule states that are granted home rule authorities, like in New York City and Baltimore. In other instances, regardless of home rule status, state law supersedes local governing authority, particularly when the state wants to establish a minimum threshold to which the locals must abide. Our report examines preemption in the areas of economic and social policy. While we draw distinctions between these two policy areas in our analysis, there is a consistently strong linkage between social and economic policymaking and their ultimate outcomes. Specifically, our research covers the policy areas of minimum wage, paid leave, anti-discrimination, ride-sharing, home sharing, municipal broadband, and the tax exemption and tax and expenditure limitations. I will provide a deeper dive on some of these issues now. Turning first to anti-discrimination, we know that cities have moved to cement social progress and protect the rights of marginalized groups through anti-discrimination ordinances. These laws may deal with discrimination in the areas of employment, use of public facilities, and commercial activities. We know that at least 225 local governments prohibit employment discrimination on the basis of gender identity. 3 states have passed explicit statutory preemption of local anti-discrimination ordinances, which you can see here on the map. Turning now to minimum wage, 25 states currently have some kind of preemption of minimum wage ordinances. Many of these states, such as New Hampshire and Colorado, have had long-standing preemption because authority to regulate wages was never granted to cities. A growing number of state legislatures have considered explicit statutory preemption. Alabama and North Carolina are 2 states that took action in 2016. We also look at paid leave, both sick and family leave. We know that there has been a groundswell of local momentum for paid leave. In just the past couple of years, more than 20 municipalities have passed paid sick leave laws. State attempts, however, to usurp local control over paid sick as well as family and medical leave policies persist. 19 state legislatures have passed laws that preempt the ability of cities to pass laws mandating employers within their jurisdictions to provide paid leave. Looking at tax and expenditure limitations, These are state or voter-imposed limitations on the ability of local governments to raise revenues, spend taxes, or both. TELs began in the 1970s in response to voter dissatisfaction with rapidly increasing inflation, property taxes, and cost of government. At the local level, TELs primarily involve property tax limitations. A total of 42 states have enacted some sort of tax and expenditure limitations. 9 states have passed a limitation that is less stringent. 26 have passed limitations that are potentially stringent on local taxing authority. And 7 states have a what we call a binding property tax limit and a general limit, which is a very stringent limitation on local authority. Turning now to ride sharing. When ride-hailing companies began to proliferate throughout the country, they were initially found, for the most part, in large metropolitan areas. But we know that that is no longer the case. Companies like Uber and Lyft, often legally referred to as transportation network companies, have entered metropolitan markets of all sizes around the world and serve populations with different needs, cultural inclinations, and political orientations. 37 state legislatures have passed bills that preempt the authority of cities to regulate transportation network companies in the way that they see fit. Over the last couple of years, legislation was proposed on TNCs in almost every state legislature in the country. Other popular areas of preemption include plastic bags, gunfire safety, nutrition, inclusionary zoning, and rent control. And with that, I am going to now turn it over to Stephanie Reich, the Vice President of State and Local Issues at Stateside Associates. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooks and Christy, and to Emma, who works with all the municipal leagues here at NLC. NLC's report is representative of what we are continuing to see at the local level, but I'm going to share with you some a little bit about the state of the cities on some sample issues that we are seeing moving along. Preemptive state policies have been enacted on a range of issues such as minimum wage laws, sharing economy like ride-sharing services and short-term rentals that Christy just mentioned, and anti-discrimination laws. However, we continue to see very, very active local governments tackle and work on issues that are extremely important and relevant to them. But I want to preface my presentation by saying that similar to policy actions cascading down from the federal government to state governments in the 80s and 90s, policy action is now cascading from the state level to the local level of government. There are many reasons why this is occurring, and I'm going to share with you some of them in no particular order. Local government is taking a more active and prominent role in advocating policies to protect budgets, residents, infrastructure, and generally wresting control from the states and federal government. Another one is local government is moving much more quickly than state or federal government can. They're smaller, they're more agile, and in many instances, less bureaucracy stands in the way. And local policymakers and elected officials are very accessible and usually more responsive than their state and federal colleagues. I think a lot of us see who do work in this area, how social media and Facebook and Twitter have played a role in this. And activists and advocates are finding state governments to be a frustrating venue for advancing especially progressive policies, which I think Christy, again, just highlighted. I want to also share that one-party dominance at the state level of government is really showing how the preemption that Christy's and Brooks' work shows us. 68 of 99 state chambers are controlled by Republicans. 25 states are controlled by Republican governors and legislative minorities. However, it's important to note that local organizations such as this, like NLC, the National Association of Counties, and the U.S. Conference of Mayors, are empowering local officials like never before. Local elected leaders now have a national stage and resources to support them. Look at the case in point. We're doing a webinar today with National League of Cities. So to put this all in context, I have with me today Peter Finn, and he's one of my lead associates and who I may or may not have poached from other departments here at Stateside, but I want to point out how active local governments are. He's been with me now for about 14 months, and he's close to hitting his 10,000 alert. We're about 400 away. So just to show you how active on some of the issues that we cover for our clients that we are, local governments are moving things. So I want to share that as a local GR professional with over 14 years of local government experience, I think it's important for government relation professionals to pay attention to both state and local governments. Especially, again, as the report shows, and you saw on their slides, it's especially important as issues ping-pong between local and state governments. going to go ahead and share with you what we're seeing, especially when it comes to minimum wage. For example, 34 cities have enacted minimum wage rates that are higher than their states. Last night, Baltimore passed a minimum wage bill on first reading that can be voted on second reading as soon as March 20th. But then, to Christy's point, look at states like Missouri. Kansas City and St. Louis both passed minimum wage laws. Missouri passed a law that attempted to preempt the local laws. They went to court, and recent court decisions are impacting mayoral and city officials. This morning, it looks like the Kansas City mayor announced that given how much he wants to move minimum wage forward in Kansas City, there may not be the will to do so right now. And then again in Birmingham, Alabama, last week, residents filed a suit against the state saying that Alabama lawmakers discriminated against Birmingham residents by preempting an order, a minimum wage ordinance to raise the city minimum wage. So I think to Christy's point, while there is preemption happening, cities are still moving and still struggling with how to deal with wage issues in their cities. And as we know, bills and other actions move quickly at the local level, regardless of what court finds in anyone's jurisdictions. It's likely that cities will continue to act and respond to issues that are important to their residents. So we need, as government relations professionals, to pay attention, especially to the issues that we're talking about. And then again, we're still seeing issues like short-term rentals, minimum wage, plastic bags, and taxes at the local level. Cities are struggling to raise revenue in this new era. Many are looking now to tax sugary sweet beverages, aka what we know as the sugar tax and plastic bags. We have seen ballot measures in California and Colorado cities like Boulder for sugary sweet beverages, more recently Santa Fe, who's trying to work on a budget, Philadelphia, and Seattle. But since January, 13 states are also considering these types of taxes. And with plastic bags, we know New York, the governor announced that he would like to supersede any local plastic bag ordinances, but there are many jurisdictions in New York City, and on our maps we're just showing a sample of cities that are still struggling with plastic bag issues, especially in the Northeast like Massachusetts. And again, with the sharing economy and new technologies are also moving quickly at the municipal level. Look at autonomous vehicles. Boston, Pittsburgh have moved swiftly to identify and work with companies to have them come to their cities. But still, the state and federal governments are also struggling with those issues. And then there's always the topic of short-term rentals. I just want to point out that there have been over 100 short-term rental bills introduced this year, along with others being reconsidered, like Nashville, who are, after passing it last year, going back to tweak it. So I think it's really important for cities, for us to pay attention to cities because there's no single approach and there's no consistent terminology at the state or local level on these issues. I think Peter and I have found, especially when it comes to short-term rentals, they're called all different sorts of things. Peter, why don't you go ahead and share with us what some of those things are called?
Sure, yeah. Given the volume of short-term rental legislation passed, it's not surprising that a lot of these cities are employing new terminology. There have been a number of local measures using different terminology. You know, certain regions are introducing new language for these issues. Arlington County in Virginia, for example, has a measure pending this year using the phrase accessory homestay, which is new, while Bozeman in Montana recently used the phrase tourist home, which has begun to catch on quite a bit from what we've seen. Aside from that, we've seen such terms as the classic short-term rentals, vacation rental, vacation home, transient lodging, tourist home, like I said, home share, or just homestay.
So again, as we have been working with National League of Cities on talking about preparing for this webinar, we can see from the research that they did and what we're seeing at the local level, local governments are still very active. They still have the dilemmas of being controlled by different governing factors in their state and their state constitutions. But it's important that we all pay attention to both state and local governments as we do our work in this area.
So I think with that, we're open to any questions. I apologize for any of the audio difficulties that folks might have had. Hopefully everyone's on now, but if there's any questions, feel free to submit them via the chat function on your one. So I think we have the first one, and looks like this is for the folks at NLC. So in general, how are cities reacting to the preemptive measures from the states?
Well, Tim, cities are reacting to preemptive measures from states in a number of ways. Ultimately, people who live in cities want control of their own destinies, but when states seek blanket policies that run counter to the values of its cities, local leaders do not stand down. Loss of local control means that cities cannot curtail laws to fit their needs, creating economic implications, especially when fiscal authority is limited. Preemption can also have human rights implications when social policy affects groups like the working mothers or the LGBT community.
Excellent, thank you. Stephanie, anything to add on to that?
No, I think Brooks is right. I think what we see across the nation is that cities or counties, too, to include them as well, you see that the legislation that they've spent a lot of time on fighting for the residents is either being preempted proactively or reactively. I think they do stand their ground, and as evidenced by both St. Louis and Kansas City, they went to court and wanted to protect the rights of their residents as much as they could.
Excellent. So another one, Stephanie, this one is probably for you and Peter. Realistically, how often are these issues really appearing on agendas, and how much do you see them? I think
almost every day. I think there's issues that are very important to cities, and besides where most people think that they're just there to tax them or to do their budgets, there are issues that affect residents that cities have the authority to legislate and to implement, and short-term rentals that we talked about, ride sharing, some of the issues, paid leave, wage equity, these are daily occurrences, plastic bags, environmental issues. I think they're just, cities are struggling with what to do and want to do the right thing, and so they're looking to make policy decisions for the residents that elected them.
All right, the next one is, looks like for NLC, what we're proposing is, what rights do cities have in terms of state preemption? What is the dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, the dynamic is this is really challenging for cities because the U.S. Constitution does not mention local governments. Instead, the 10th Amendment reserves authority giving powers to the states. So, while this is the case, there is a great deal of diversity in state-local relations between as well as within those states. As Christy mentioned at the outset, generally speaking, states provide either narrow, through Dillon's rule, or broad home rule governing authority to cities, defined in the state constitution and by statute enacted by the legislator. So kind of breaking those down, Dillon's rule allows the state legislator to control local government structure, methods of financing activities, its procedures, and the authority to make and implement policy. Due to the rigidity of Dillon's rule, some states began to adopt home rule provisions in the early 1900s. Home rule limits the degree of state interference in local affairs and delegates power from the state to local governments.
I think Brooks is right in the sense that, states struggle with this on a daily basis. Sometimes they do look to the states and federal government for some of their financial resources, but residents look to them for the everyday policy making and want some action taken on issues that are important to them.
Got it. I guess last question or another question, what can cities do when they face this states that are overreaching or states that are, trying to obviously, exert control over them?
Sure. From our perspective at the National League of Cities, we see really 3 critical recommendations on this point. Starting first with mayors and other local leaders using the bully pulpit that they have and engaging in active communication with their state legislators. Secondly, we really think you should choose preemption battles wisely. Oftentimes there's a lot of choice to be made here from a legal fight perspective, and figuring out where you can marshal the resources to really actively go against these laws, constraining cities' availability to pass policy is really the way to go. And finally, address the preemption narrative directly, particularly focusing on economic arguments, because this is really where we can bolster the resources at the local level to make a strong case to allow cities to pass and kind of implement the laws that they're trying to do.
And I think I would add to go on a point that I made earlier is groups like National Association of Counties, U.S. Conference of Mayors, and like this, the National League of Cities, are resources for city officials who can come together. NLC has their conference next week here in D.C. to share best practices, to talk about the issues that are important to them, how they're struggling with the issues maybe, both at the national and federal level. I know NLC has a lobby day, and they talk to their federal leaders to work on these issues, and all of these are issues that are facing cities alike, from East Coast, West Coast, North, South. And I think when they come together in an organization, that also allows companies to participate and hear from companies about issues that are important to them. I think there's a two-way conversation that is able to happen.
Got it. And last question, is it realistically possible to stay on top of all of these issues, and considering how many cities are around the country? I mean, what would be, from the folks here in the room, what would be best practices as far as trying to stay on top or prioritize or just, stay engaged?
I mean, from our perspective here at the National League of Cities, we're certainly listening to our members and seeking to, track and actively do research and look at kind of policy recommendations on issues that they bring to us. When we did this particular report, the 7 areas that we tested for really were a reflection of what we have been hearing from the state leagues, as well as, city leaders on the ground. And so that's really how we try to kind of look through this, a city-centric lens, thinking about, what issues are important for cities. It's hard, though, with all of the municipalities out there, 19,000 of them. I can imagine that the job you all are doing, trying to track the ordinances taking place, can be tricky at times.
So, Brooks, if I could just ask you, I think for those of us on the call, not everyone may know, who are your members? Is it just mayors, is it council members, or is it just city officials? Sure. So they have to be elected in general? And can you say, I know we both talked about the municipal leagues, can you say who are members of those as well?
Sure. So the way that we were structured is 92 years ago, the state municipal leagues, which are smaller versions of the National League of Cities, created the National League of Cities. And so now we partner with the municipal leagues, and through both us and them, we represent 90% of all communities. So from the smallest town to the largest city. And we represent the full city. So while most of all we have the mayors and city council members engage with us at our conference, all members of the city are welcome, and even on our policy committees we have staff that does engage as well. So
I'll answer the question after you answer it again. What are the issues that I think are the hot topics that may be coming up at your conference next week that your city officials are struggling with?
Sure. So one of the things we do on an annual basis is our State of the Cities research, which allows us to look at mayoral State of the City speeches and find out what are the critical issues. And so as we're driving our advocacy agenda, we look at the top 3 there. And as our CEO always talks about, it's PI. It's public safety, infrastructure, and economic development. And those consistently come up as top issues for city leaders. That's what we'll be talking about this year.
And I think, too, I would agree, that's what we're seeing on city agendas. Same, public safety a lot, as you can imagine, infrastructure and economic development. As I think the pieces of the pie get smaller, they have to figure out how to make the pie bigger and go to more family members, right? And so those are issues, but I think it's how they get there is what we see, and the issues that they're tackling, sort of like we've talked about, especially with the new economy and the Internet of Things, and changing how, a lot of cities need to catch up with where their statutes are. A fun story while I was working in government is that for a certain type of hearing, you could only do court reporting because that's what the statute dictated. I didn't even realize that technology had come so far that we can do recordings like a WebEx we could do today and have those testify via Skype. So just to think about where technology is in your city and how to advance it. And I think NLC also has a study coming out about economic development in the cities, which we see is how to tackle not just incentives but retention, and to keep companies and jobs there, and especially in a jurisdiction like DC where you have surrounding jurisdictions so close who may have disparate minimum wage laws. How do you retain that economic development? So I think it ties all of your research together and what we're seeing at the local level.
Well, great. Any parting thoughts for, I think that wraps up the Q&A session. I'd like to thank everybody for participating. Again, I know we had a little bit of audio issues in the beginning, but we will be sending out the audio file along with the slides to folks who may have missed the beginning, and they will follow this call either later this afternoon or first thing tomorrow morning. But thank you, everyone, for participating, and if anyone has any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to any or all of us that have a great day, everyone. Thank you.